So as people come in, I just want to say welcome to this panel and on Central European Empire at the Fin-de-siècle. But we're going to hold off for just a couple minutes to give people time to filter in and join us before I introduce our speakers. So if you'll bear with us, we have some extra time today because we will only have 2 papers, not 3. And so there's time for us to wait just for a moment to see if some more audience members will join us. Couple people just came in. I'm Dan Unowsky. I'll be chairing the session, and I'm just going to give another minute or 2 to see if a few more audience members will join us before we start. So just bear with us for a moment if you don't mind.
Excuse me.
Okay. All right, why don't we go ahead and begin this panel, Central European Empire at the Fin-de-siècle. And I am delighted to be here with all of you as chair, and I'll offer a few comments at the end. My name is Daniel Unowsky. I'm professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of Memphis. And let me introduce our speakers. We're only going to have 2 papers today, not the advertised 3. So I apologize for that, but these things do happen, as everyone knows. One thing before I introduce our speakers is that you might note the subtitle of the panel seems to be a Memphis and New Orleans panel. And of course, I'm in Memphis, but perhaps it should be Atlanta in New Orleans, as all 3 who were supposed to be speaking, but certainly the 2 who are with us are both PhD students at Georgia State University. And this panel highlights, obviously, a strong program there, which maybe we'll find out a little bit more about in the discussion. So let me introduce our speakers, and then we'll go in the order listed on the program. So our first speaker will be Blake Morley, Matthew Blake Morley, who is a student of modern European intellectual and cultural history at Georgia State University, and his research focuses on the intersections of aesthetic thought and politics in late 19th and early 20th centuries. He's currently working on a dissertation that explores the relationship between Viennese modernism and Austria-Hungary's colonial mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And obviously, that's at the center of what we're going to hear about today. The title I have, Calais' Gesamtkunstwerk, Locating Colonial Bosnia and Fin-de-siècle Austria-Hungary. Our second speaker will be Shawn Reagan, who is also a PhD candidate at Georgia State University. And his main area of research is in modern Europe with a specific focus on the Second German Empire in Africa. The paper here is part of, or comes out of, a dissertation chapter titled Colonial Literature and Lived Experience, Redefining Germanness in Southwest Africa, 1884 to 1915. And as part of his overall dissertation, which investigates German settler identity formation in Southwest Africa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And he teaches introductory survey courses at Georgia State University. So again, what we'll do is we'll just go in the order we have. So I'm asking Blake to come on up and speak. The usual limit for these papers at conferences like this is about 20 minutes, though we do have flexibility since there's only two. But still, I'd ask our speakers to try to stay fairly close to that 20 minutes. So without further delay, Blake, go right ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Unowsky. And yeah, let me say this is actually great to be here. This has been nearly 2.5 years in the making.
Right.
So great to finally kind of get this in the works. The title of my paper is Calais' Gesamtkunstwerk, Locating Colonial Bosnia and Fin-de-siècle Austria-Hungary. And where this idea kind of comes from, or what I'm working with, is the fact that today, scholars are still debating whether or not Bosnia can be categorized as a colony. This is striking to me in light of the fact that, first, the territory was obtained through military conquest, albeit one sanctioned by international agreement. Second, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire did benefit from the exploitation of Bosnia's natural resources, often at the expense of local populations. Now, of course, there are questions over the extent to which Austria-Hungary did benefit from this sort of economic relationship, but it still is a matter of record that there was a level of resource extraction coming out of Bosnia. Third, the occupation did rely on the co-opting and maintenance of existing elite power structures. Fourth, the occupation was legitimized and maintained through the co-opting of existing elite power structures. Finally, for 21 of the 40-year Austro-Hungarian period, the administration of Bosnia was under the near-dictatorial rule of one man, the Hungarian-born joint finance minister Benjamin Calais. Calais, like most of his peers, believed it was the duty of the Habsburg Empire to turn Bosnia into a, quote, enlightened European state. Thus, there's very little, in my view, that differentiated Austria-Hungary from other Western colonial powers and their reliance on the language of civilization and progress. Now, despite its similarities, there are noticeable differences. For one, while Austria-Hungary did indeed seek to modernize Bosnian society through a massive economic and infrastructure program, as well as this kind of quintessential civilizing mission, the imperial administration also ensured that many of the old pre-existing traditions, customs, and social practices were maintained. Notably, this was the case with the conservative Catholic Empire's willingness to maintain a Muslim-dominated feudal structure, as well as its resistance to agrarian reform at the expense of Bosnia's predominantly Catholic peasantry. But all in all, when viewing the historical record, it's difficult to see the events occurring between 1878 and 1918 as anything other than colonialism. Nevertheless, the fact that a lingering debate continues concerning the colonial status of Bosnia is, in my opinion, the novelty of the Austro-Hungarian colonial mission. A successful empire, after all, is one that best obscures or hides its power. The essay I presented today explores this idea of colonial invisibility. Now, invisibility, of course, seems somewhat contradictory to think. When we think about Austria-Hungary, this seems very contradictory, the idea of invisibility. Throughout the majority of the 20th century, historians viewed the empire as an antiquated and overly aesthetic model of imperialism. Of course, this is best summarized in 1940s by A.P. Taylor, who argues that the empire was, quote, grandiose, full of superficial life, but sterile within it. It was theater, not reality. By equating the Austro-Hungarian Empire to theater, Taylor alludes to an imperial society where art, ceremony, and the symbolism of court life were used to legitimize the Habsburg emperors of power and authority. Such a view perpetuated a narrative that the artificiality of Austro-Hungarian imperialism prevented the empire from adapting to the modern age. We, of course, have had a wonderful revisionist movement to this, Peter Judson being one of the primary leaders of this, that have challenged this view and revealing a much more dynamic and malleable form of imperialism. Nevertheless, the image of Austria-Hungary as this sort of pre-modern aesthetic empire endures. And when we juxtapose the traditional mode of aesthetic imperialism against the more enlightened, rational modes associated with 19th or early 20th century France, Great Britain, and then later the United States, we are making certain assumptions concerning Austria-Hungary's place in Western modernity. Implicit here, I believe, is a belief that Austria-Hungarian aesthetic imperialism and the imperial culture which produced it were the final casualties of the old world at the hands of the new. So strong is this narrative of imperial culture's death in the catastrophe of the First World War that it has become a founding myth of modern culture. And yet, somewhat paradoxically, cultural, intellectual, and art historians continue to point out the immense influences of Austria-Hungary's diverse imperial society on the modern world. This, of course, is what we find in the Vienna Fin-de-siècle or Vienna 1900 literature. Nevertheless, despite what we now have come to see as the endurance of Austro-Hungarian imperial symbolism in Fin-de-siècle culture, the Vienna 1900 literature tends to repeat this standard narrative. After World War I, the emperor is dead, long live modern culture. At the very least, if Frederick Jameson is correct, Austro-Hungarian imperialism may have survived the crisis of the Fin-de-siècle, but only as a melancholic residue in modernist cultural production. It is, of course, difficult to argue otherwise, as Austria-Hungary's collapse in 1918 signaled a resounding and final defeat of absolute power at the hands of modern democratic nation-state. However, relegating Austro-Hungarian imperialism to the dustbin of history suggests a far too discontinuous relationship between 19th century imperial culture and the more modern 20th century cultural industries. What interests me are the places where these two cultural fields, the imperial and the modern, intersect. It is my suggestion, at least in this paper, that in the waning years of the empire, Benny Calais and his team of what I'm calling imperial artists developed a new type of aesthetic imperialism that not only reflected the modern age, but was also directly influenced by and contributed to the modernist discourses on art and culture occurring within the empire's major urban centers at the Fin-de-siècle. Put differently, if Jacob Burckhardt is correct that the Italian Renaissance was the first moment the modern state is treated as an object of reflection and calculation and therefore a work of art, my suggestion is that the end of the 19th century was the moment when agents of Austro-Hungarian imperialism in Bosnia attempted to reorganize the state as a modernist work of art. I am drawn to this idea due to the fact that Calais believed that modern art and culture were necessary for the rejuvenation of Bosnian society. And mind you, this is not necessarily Austro-Hungarian art and culture. This is very explicitly modern art and culture. Take, for example, the fact that as a crucial component of Calais' modernization program, architects and designers from the empire's major urban centers were brought in to introduce modern theories of design. Sarajevo's cityscape, in particular, was drastically altered to mirror Vienna's Ringstrasse. While this did not entail a physical ring road around a central location, Sarajevo's natural geography restricting, it did involve the copying of Viennese architectural practices and visual styles. Otto Wagner's influence, in particular, is prevalent. But by the 1890s, the urban landscape saw the emergence of a new style of decoration, drawing on the arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau, and the Vienna Secession. These more modernist aesthetic practices allowed for the emergence of this modernist colonial fantasy that was both modern and representative of Bosnia's Ottoman history. This so-called neo-Moorish style was produced by Austrian architects, designers, and artists, in my opinion, to link the liberal modernity of the Austrian colonizers with the traditionalism of the Muslim population. Thus, Calais' urban design served two functions. First, by incorporating modern architecture with this sort of pseudo-Ottoman decorative style, urban space combined the historical, religious, and ideological meanings that the colonial mission was intent to present. Sarajevo quite literally became a stage in which the buildings and surrounding spaces were treated as set designs to give substance to Calais' modernization narratives. Thus, it seems that Austria-Hungary's colonial mission was based on a civilizing ideology not dissimilar from its other European counterparts, but one in which a primitive past and a modern present were allowed to coexist. Calais himself expressed this when he stated that his mission was to, quote, build upon the old, to retain the ancient traditions of the land vivified and purified by modern ideas. We see this same premise at work in other aspects of the colonial mission. Modern cultural institutions, from theaters, museums, to literary journals, were introduced in an effort to bring Bosnia culturally closer to the West. This, of course, is characteristic of all European empire in the 19th and early 20th century. However, while these institutions were run by and promoted the works of Austro-Hungarian modern artists and intellects, the administration's program of urban and cultural modernization ensured that an authentic Ottoman or Muslim aesthetic was maintained in the art and architecture. Considerable space, indeed, was given to traditional Bosnian art, literature, music, and local craft industries. Calais' effort to promote an apolitical, multicultural Bosnian identity was no less contradictory. Like other imagined communities, this Bosnian identity, or Bošnjactvo, was meant to transcend the particularities of difference. However, Bosnia's different groups already had a shared common language, and to a lesser extent, ethnicity. Difference, in the case of Bosnia, was rooted in religion. Calais' pursuit for this common identity begins with the establishment of the Landis Museum, Bosnia's first archaeological and natural history museum in Sarajevo. The goal was to establish a historical continuity between the various ethnic and religious groups. If Calais could link a shared origin to the diverse beliefs and practices, while simultaneously avoiding any religious or political connotations, it was believed that this Bosnian identity could become a new regional patriotism that would combat the multiple nationalisms infiltrating the borders. Opened in 1888, the Landis Museum became a repository of many different cultural artifacts that defined Bosnia's shared history. These include handmade Ottoman arts and crafts, various traditional costumes representing the diverse multiple nationalities, and religious artifacts. The task, however, And I think this is key to understanding this as a modernist sort of imperial project. The task was to locate what Calais saw as being an authentic Bosnian spirit. Once awakened within individuals through the sort of performative space of the museum, this spirit would create a shared emotional attachment, not to similarity, but to difference. That is to say, a Bosnian identity based on not that which makes us the same, but that which makes us different. The Landis Museum also demonstrates one of the primary characteristics of this idea of colonial invisibility. For example, the archaeological expeditions unearthed relics dating as far back as the Romans. Linking Bosnia's present to the Romans established this sort of pre-European history that existed before the Ottoman Empire. Thus, Calais was able to subvert the colonizing narrative by turning the Austro-Hungarian project from one of occupation to liberation. The administration was no longer civilizing the Eastern other, but resurrecting the other from a pre-existing European progressive line that had previously been cut off from the, quote, barbarian invasion. The colonial mission, and more importantly, this idea of colonial invisibility, raises several important questions regarding the history of Austria-Hungary at the turn of the century. First, how does an empire that relies on imperial signs, symbols, and ceremonies to legitimize its authority adapt when those modes of representation enter a period of crisis due to the crisis of representation associated with fin-de-siècle modernism? Second, in what other ways did Austro-Hungarian aesthetic imperialism adapt, given that this crisis of representation was not limited to the effects of modernism itself? This is to say that in the process of colonizing Bosnia, the Catholic Austro-Hungarian Empire encountered a predominantly Muslim population that had its own aesthetic ideals and modes of representation. My project that this paper starts looks to the different effects of this encounter, what the strategies were that were employed to replicate or in fact reinvent the ideal of Habsburg unity and harmony in response to this encounter. But most importantly, what interests me is how the modernist aesthetic, cultural, and political innovations at the Fin-de-siècle allow for the restructuring of Austria-Hungary's aesthetic imperialism to accommodate this dual crisis of representation in Bosnia. I, of course, don't have the answers to these questions yet. This is only the beginning of a much larger project I am working on. But I would say that at minimum, what we see in Bosnia is the emergence of an entirely new method of colonialization, where other imperial powers sought to modernize their respective colonies at the end of the 19th century through science and technology. My argument is that Austria-Hungary treated its colony and the colonial subject within it as works of art, and moreover, as works of art that could be perfected through the application of its modernist aesthetic principles. In other words, the colony itself became a total work of art. That is my presentation. I'll pass it on to you, Shawn.
Before Shawn Reagan begins, I just want to remind our audience, you can go ahead and put any comments or questions in the chat during the talks. It's just we won't get to respond to those until the end, but feel free to write in the chat at any time if you wish. So go ahead, Shawn. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Dr. Unowsky, and thank you also, Mr. Morley. That was a great presentation. And like you said, this conference has been 2 years in the making for us, and it's really exciting to finally get into it. I've been working on this topic for so long now, starting back 2.5 years ago, that here we finally are. So without further ado, Fin-de-siècle Europe was marked by such a fascinating and intense shift in culture from the before time, the long, long ago, into modernity and into the 20th century. However, the term Fin-de-siècle, it's often reserved for two places in the literature. It's France and Austria. It's only recently that we've seen it begun to branch out into other areas. So Parisian and Viennese culture around the turn of the century contains some major themes that run throughout this entire period. Degeneration theory and pessimism are the focal points for a wave of literature and art at the turn of the century in France and Austria. However, as I will argue through this paper, similar themes can be found in fin-de-siècle Germany as readily as in its two neighbors. The general angst and gloom that emanate from the pages of someone like Joris Karl Huysmans' Against Nature or The Damned, or Max Nordau's Degeneration, can also be found in the autobiographies and other ego documents of German colonial settlers, such as people like Margarethe von Eckenbrecher and Elsa Sonnenberg, who we're going to become much more familiar with by the end of this presentation. For example, Eckenbrecher once wrote about her desire to escape the industrialized European world. In this presentation, I argue that the rejection of modernity, the German settlers' flight to Africa, specifically German Southwest Africa, the interactions between white Germans and indigenous Southwest Africans, and the subsequent war and genocide against the Herrera people were the culmination of an interpretation of degenerative culture and racial science found in fin-de-siècle Germany. To accomplish this, I juxtaposed the autobiographies of two German settlers, the aforementioned Margarethe von Eckenbrecher and Elsa Sonnenberg, against some more well-known writings from fin-de-siècle France and Austria. These German settler writers found fin-de-siècle Germany as degenerated as France and Austria, and although their writings are not nearly as well known as someone like Huysmans or Max Nordau, they nevertheless sensed something amiss in their culture and sought to rectify these misgivings in their own unique way. Their solution was to emigrate from Germany to German Southwest Africa as a rejection of modernity in order to return to a simpler pastoral life of farming. After they arrived in Southwest Africa, however, they found that their new existences partly confirmed their romantic vision. Margarethe von Eckenbrecher, for example, once wrote that Southwest Africa was this fertile paradise, this untamed natural virgin land. In Southwest Africa, German women, like Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg, could escape the expectations of a pessimistic domestic existence set by fin-de-siècle Europe. These German settlers, Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg, fled modernity and tried to reinvent themselves in a simpler, idyllic pastoral existence. German colonial fantasies were about rural life away from the city and all of its social and moral ills, wrote Katharina Gerstenberger in a recent book entitled Truth to Tell. But these settlers quickly found themselves at odds with their romantic view of such a simpler life. Soon after their arrival in Southwest Africa, they determined that this simpler life supposedly lived by indigenous Southwest Africans was too foreign, and instead of trying to live a simpler life, they quickly saw a need to civilize and to modernize. And here it's where we see a fascinating shift in the thinking and thought processes of the settlers. They left metropolitan Europe to reject modernity, but when they were confronted with the decidedly unmodern indigenous inhabitants of Southwest Africa, they changed their attitudes rather hastily. The back-to-nature existence that they envisioned did not fit with reality. The confrontation with this truth led to their newfound mission of civilizing the uncivilized, so goes the old quote. As Elsa Sonnenberg once wrote, the Herrera is unable to develop his own land, and so it must be the job of the civilized Germans to help him. But how did this about-face happen? Racial science, representative of the fin-de-siècle, determined that white Europeans were the superior race and Africans were much lower on the evolutionary scale, which is readily reflected in the writings of many of these settlers. Margarethe von Eckenbrecher described her earliest encounters with this description of some indigenous Southwest Africa. Quote, "The main characteristics of the Herrera people are arrogance, cruelty, and laziness. He looks down on anyone not of his tribe." The derogatory term, racial term for the Namaqua people that I'm not going to repeat here, are generally small, lean, and wrinkled. They are too casual at work. They are weak. They are lazy. End quote. It did not take long for this civilizing mission to become a top priority for average settlers like Eckenbrecher or Sonnenberg. They did not leave Germany with a civilizing mission in mind necessarily, but after contact with Africans, these settlers began writing about their newfound goal of civilizing. Quotes like these are not uncommon in the latter pages of their autobiographies. Quote, I am firmly convinced more than any other people it is we Germans, by virtue of the new racial laws, who are destined to be the bearers of culture and civilization in Africa, wrote Margarethe von Eckenbrecher. However, there was an inability to effectively civilize these Southwest Africans, that is, to make them compliant to the awful treatment by the German government. By late 1903, there was an entirely new problem. After a few short years of encroachment on Herrera lands, local disagreements over land quickly turned into war, which ultimately led to the first 20th century genocide, because as these settlers saw it, the nature of the Herrera rendered them incapable of civilization. The rationale behind this stems from understandings of social Darwinism and other pseudosciences. But let's back up for a minute. To understand this juxtaposition of Fin-de-siècle Germany with other European nations, we must also look at the Fin-de-siècle as a European-wide cultural phenomenon. Fin-de-siècle France and Austria were seen as undergoing several modern problems: urbanization, political radicalization, moral panic, fear about cultural degeneration in several forms. Urbanization following the 19th century industrial boom is closely tied to political radicalization because of the way Paris and Vienna modernized. The moral panic was characterized by a hard to quantify but still general angst felt by people. The panic over cultural degeneration in Paris and Vienna came about because of the perception that modernity created grave excess. Let's now briefly map these fin-de-siècle terms in order to set up the juxtaposition of German fin-de-siècle culture. And in order to understand urbanization and political radicalization, I'm going to take the case study of Émile Henry, a young French anarchist that in fin-de-siècle France, and there were a number of factors that radicalized Henry into using explosives as a political tool, but it mostly boils down to his rejection of modern life in France. Henry's actions and ideology spawned from urbanization in metropolitan areas of France. Paris is the big one that we would often associate. The old adage that the rich became richer and the poor became poorer exemplifies the grievances of an activist like Henry. Seeing no other way to achieve his goals that being those aligned with the socialists and anarchists alike, forced him into political radicalism. In contrast to Henry, though, there were different ways that other fin-de-siècle Europeans dealt with the problems of urbanization. It did not always lead to political radicalization in the same way. Instead of throwing bombs like Henry, some chose to leave the metropole in their own protest of a rejection of modernity characterized by modern urbanization. Margarethe von Eckenbrecher, our settler from before, wrote that, quote, "A bigger difference cannot be imagined. Berlin, the center of German culture and science, in an isolated farm in Damaraland." Damaraland is just a small area in Southwest Africa. In this, it's obvious that Eckenbrecher saw her isolated farm as the ideal type in contrast to the epicenter of modernity in Berlin. She wrote this about Southwest Africa, quote, "How this world is so great, so festive, so wondrous, so wonderfully beautiful," end quote. Then she goes on to say, "The Namib offered a most glorious view, veiled in a blue haze. It is among the most beautiful things I've ever glimpsed in my life. So splendidly exalted, I could have clasped my hands and said, 'Dear God, I thank thee for vouchsafing to me that I might see thy beauty in the wilderness. I will gladly endure hunger and thirst and privation, but let me enjoy the wonder of their creation far from the hustle and bustle of mankind," end quote. For all the moral and cultural problems perceived by someone like Eckenbrecher here, they set out from a stable, industrial, and modern European nation-state thousands of miles away, halfway across the world, into a completely new environment to them. In contrast to urban Berlin, they describe enormous tracts of pastoral farmland in Southwest Africa. It's a vastly different image. And similarly, we can see a rejection of modernity through fear of moral panic caused by a general apprehension of modernity. Colonial life in Southwest Africa offered a liberation from the sickness of modernity. At first sight of this coast in Southwest Africa, Margarethe von Eckenbrecher wrote with relief, "We stood at the railing of our transport ship. We looked at our land of promise with warm feelings. Over there is your new home. Will you find happiness there? What lies in store for you?" End quote. For settlers like Eckenbrecher and Zonenberg, the possibilities in Southwest Africa were seemingly limitless. They truly believed that the cure for the illness of modernity lay in Southwest Africa. And it's significant here to explicitly define what this sickness was. What was the cause of all this malady for Europeans during the Fin-de-siècle? A sense of cultural degeneration permeated throughout Fin-de-siècle Europe. There are a few examples to point to which illustrates this perceived collapse of morality. Max Nordau's work, Degeneration, helps elucidate this very well. Degeneration, as described by Nordau, was a degenerative break with the, quote, traditional views of custom and morality. Similarly, someone like Adolf Loos, his collection of essays, Ornament and Crime, criticized the cultural degeneration of modern society. Loos employed a peculiar metaphor that particularly stands out. He said, at 2, the child sees the eyes of a Papillon, at 4, with those of an ancient Teuton, at 6, of Socrates, and at 8, of Voltaire. The Papillon metaphor harkens to the amoral, noble savage who knows no better. This also plays into the assumptions about race science we also see with German settlers who think of the indigenous Southwest Africans as some sort of amoral savage. Eckenbrecher, our settler from before, noted that the natives in Southwest Africa lacked understanding of what it meant to be civilized, whatever that means. The rude customs of some of the African girls she had in her employ were distressing to her because of their supposed lack of civility. However, Eckenbrecher forgave them for what she perceived as their uncivilized manners simply because they did not know any better, according to her. One key word associated with this degenerative illness of modernity needs further explanation as well, a word that I've used a few times already, decadence, which it can be representative by one of Joris Karl Huysmans' novels, Against Nature, and then also another one, The Damned. Des Esseintes, the main character in Huysmans' novel Against Nature, indulged in every modern pleasure Paris had to offer and tried to retire to the countryside, only to have his health rapidly deteriorate and a doctor ordered his return to Paris. Des Esseintes offers a compelling parallel to the German settlers we've been discussing. The German settlers indulged in modernity for a time before attempting to reinvent themselves in Southwest Africa, just as Des Esseintes tried to leave modern Paris for the countryside. Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg were both relatively well-off from relatively well-off middle-class families in Germany. They both attended school, were more or less set up for successful existences in the metropole, but despite, or perhaps because of their middle-class status, they chose to emigrate to Southwest Africa to leave middle-class life behind. However, the settlers, just as Des Esseintes, quickly realized that the simpler life was not as idyllic as they had imagined. Initially, many Germans quickly fell in love with the wide open spaces and freedom that Southwest Africa offered, but just as quickly realized that this romanticized vision was nothing more than a fantasy. Similarly, in Huysmans' The Damned, the novelist Durtel, the eponymous character, is revolted by degenerative modernity. Durtel tries to relieve himself from the sickness of modernity. He removes himself mentally by studying medieval knights like Gilles de Rais, just like the German settlers rejected modernity and physically removed themselves to Southwest Africa. But there was no relief in either case. For Durtel, Guy de Rais, a skilled general that fought alongside Joan of Arc, also happened to be a serial killer who sexually assaulted and tortured his young victims. For Margarita von Eckenbrecher and Elsa Sonnenberg, their escape to a simpler pastoral existence in Southwest Africa proved to be a fairy tale. Beneath the surface of Durtel's attempt to mentally escape a serial killer, and beneath the surface of Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg's escape lay conflict, which eventually turned into war and genocide. The beginning of the Herrera War, or the Herrera Uprising in 1904, was a pivotal moment in the lives of these settlers. And to better understand this, I have to take a brief interlude into The Culture in Time and Space by Stephen Kern. In it, the underlying thesis seems to be that modernity in all of its forms created the conditions necessary for the First World War. In other words, war, in Kern's case, the First World War, in Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg's case, the Herrera War of 1904, was the culmination of modernity in the Fin-de-siècle. These German settlers used fin-de-siècle concepts of racial science to justify their treatments of indigenous Southwest Africans, as well as the German government's actions that resulted in war and eventually genocide. The same settlers who fled from the hustle and bustle of modern Germany to escape from the angst associated with the fin-de-siècle quickly sought positions of authority as members of the presumed superior race in the African colonies. German settlers encroached on indigenous land and provoked the Herero at every turn in a variety of ways. For example, the best agricultural land was seized from the indigenous Southwest Africans, either by the German government or German businesses, and given or sold to German settlers at reasonable prices. Forced instruction in the civilized German language also necessitated for Southwest Africa was also necessitated for Southwest African children living near major cities like Swakopmund or Windhoek. Nevertheless, Eckenbrecher commented on the audacity of the uncivilized Herero for demanding fairer treatment. She wrote, quote, "The Herero, who were naturally violent and arrogant, became even more arrogant as time passed during relations between the settlers and the Southwest Africans." Elsa Sonnenberg similarly wrote on the eve of the 1904 Herrera War that there is, quote, "insufficient reason for the dreadful uprising of the blacks." In other words, Sonnenberg thought that Germans trying to bring civilization to Southwest Africa in heavy-handed and brutal ways that prevented indigenous Southwest Africans from existence they had lived with for centuries before German contact proved insufficient reason for the Herero to fight back. In the minds of the settlers, the Herero uprising was completely unprovoked. Sonnenberg went so far as to describe the treatment of the Herero as kind, benevolent, and lenient. It became clear to the German settlers that the indigenous Southwest African population could not be civilized so easily. Their escape from Fin-de-siècle Berlin did not bring within them any peace as envisioned by their romantic dream of a simpler life. The Herero uprising somehow took the German settlers completely by surprise. The Germans in charge realized that the only way to deal with this situation was to bring modern war machinery and soldiers to crush the Herero people. In June of 1904, General Lothar von Trotha arrived in Southwest Africa to take command of the German colonial army and totally crushed the Herero soldiers throughout the summer. It culminated in a decisive defeat at what became known as the Battle of Votherberg. By October, unable to control events in any meaningful way any longer, these German settler writers were witnesses to von Trotha's infamous annihilation order. But long after von Trotha's proclamation and after the end of the war and genocide in 1908, the South African government estimated that as many as 92,000 or so Southwest Africans were murdered. And this is a secret report compiled in 1915 and subsequently published in 1918. This was the price of modernity, of European modernity, for indigenous Southwest Africans. And in this presentation, I've argued that the German settlers Margarete von Eckenbrecher and Elsa Sonnenberg rejected modernity and the cultural degeneration of Fin-de-siècle Germany, what they would call the hustle and bustle of the modern city, and fled to Southwest Africa in search of a simpler, romantic view of existence. By juxtaposing those autobiographies and ego documents of Eckenbrecher and Sonnenberg against some more well-known writers of the Fin-de-siècle, I believe that I've demonstrated the continuities between German, French, and Austrian Fin-de-siècle sentiments and writings. The early interactions between these white Germans and the indigenous Southwest Africans from 1902 to 1904 demonstrated that a simpler life that they sought was not as idyllic as they wanted it to be, and quickly found themselves, instead of wanting to bring civilization to the supposedly uncivilized inhabitants of Southwest Africa. This task proved to be far more difficult than Eckenbrecher or Sonnenberg could have imagined, and once the German government realized that the Southwest Africans would not conform to its demands, German politicians and military leaders quickly concluded that, according to the racial theories of the time, the only way to deal with them was to employ the culmination of modernity, war, which led to the first modern genocide. Thank you very much. That was my presentation.
Thank you both. There's quite a few questions in the chat, but before we turn to that, I'll just say a few things that strike me about the papers, and I have a few questions for the speakers as well, but we do have time, I think, to get to the questions in the chat, some of which relate, I think, to what my own brief comments will focus on. I have just a couple of general things to say, and then maybe some specific things, and then we'll turn to the chat, and maybe at the end, if there's time, I'll ask a couple more questions about their projects overall and their department of producing such fine students working on Central Europe and Empire. But let's turn to the papers for a moment. both papers intersect, and I think for those familiar with the historiographies, you can hear the echoes of major questions in German historiography and Austria-Hungary's historiographies. Such as, what is an empire anyway? Is the Habsburg Empire like the other empires? Is it somehow different? What is the content of the subject of empire? What is the purpose of empire? How did people understand their own role in the perpetuation and creation of empire? So that, on the one hand, is a huge conversation, certainly in both German history, but more specifically right now in Habsburg history, where, as Blake mentioned, Peter Judson and many others are not just contributing to the so-called new imperial history, but in many ways are shaping the new imperial history and how scholars are approaching empire. So that certainly, I think everybody could hear those echoes there. But more specifically to this separate historiographies, Shawn Reagan's paper makes us think, of course, about continuities and discontinuities in German history as a whole. I mean, should we see this story of German empire and massacre in its continuity across 1918 into the Second World War with Himmler's colonial project and those who went there seeking to create idyllic communities in the midst of an ethnically cleansed and controlled environment in World War II? Is that the way to understand what we're seeing here with the settlers Shawn talks about? Or as Shawn seemed to do a little bit more here, to consider this as a specific example of what European powers and European adventurer settlers, right, were doing and thinking in the colonial world, whether British, French, German, and so on. And here I would say what might be fruitful for Shawn is to think about what's no longer so new, of course, but David Canadyne's ornamentalism, in which he argues that the British administrators and colonial settlers and empire, disgusted with the decay and failures of what's going on back home and the modernization that's transforming society and undermining traditional roles and structures inside British society, that in the colonies, this clean slate provides an opportunity to create British culture in an ideal form that's no longer possible back home, right? As even these, not all of them of noble extraction, but certainly many of them were, these colonial administrators set up their homes like estates with native servants and right, create a kind of idealized vision of what Britishness is supposed to do that can't exist anymore back in Great Britain, right, where the Socialist Labor Party and mass society is undermining that vision of Britishness. And we see that here in your story with these settlers from Germany and Southwest Africa. I don't know if we're seeing, I mean, that's something to talk about, but I don't know if it's as much a rejection of modernity that draws them there as this effort to say we need a pure creation of something new that is truly German, because back home, that vision of what Germanness is corrupted. And then once they get there, of course, they're faced with a very different situation than they imagined, and they turn to this semi-civilizing mission, although race says, racism says to them, well, we really can't civilize the people, right, ultimately, who are there. And if we turn to the Habsburg case, there's, of course, a much longer history of the Habsburg administrative civilizing mission. And we could go back to Joseph II and the acquisition of the province of Galicia and the sending out of administrators to turn this backward colony into a modern state. So we can see that that civilizing mission of the Habsburgs going back quite a ways. This is just a new version of it, maybe we could say, an administrator trying to trying to do it all in a short time from the top down in a different context, but but certainly it echoes across that more than 100 years. For the Habsburg civilizing project there, it intersects again with this question of what is an empire and what do we study when we study the Habsburg Empire. And it's moved from thinking of the center, an empire has to be the center controlling the periphery, which doesn't fit most of the Habsburg monarchy, right? I mean, if you take Galicia, it's not a colony when Polish-speaking Galicians end up being prime ministers and foreign ministers back in Vienna and actually controlling the state, some might argue, for or certainly influencing the center, not just controlling things on the ground in the periphery. So that kind of model of empire doesn't work. So that's in part why Habsburg scholarship forces a reconsideration of what empire is, that empire is a complex intermix of different institutions and groups among themselves in the periphery and in interaction with the center, shaping, not just being shaped by the relationship and the umbrella of empire. And so I think Blake gets at that to some degree, but I think we have to watch out of the top, this idea of the top shaping. But of course, Calais is a very specific Habsburg administrator. Notice Blake mentioned this, but he was his position was not colonial viceroy, although that's what he was, but he was the finance minister, the joint finance minister, which in the complicated system, the finance ministry only dealt with financing the joint ministries, not the state as a whole. And they didn't know what else to do with Bosnia, so they put it under him, and he had a kind of a free hand. So Bosnia is different from every other part of the Habsburg monarchy, and maybe it is something like more like a colonial relationship in this more classic historiographical sense. Something I wanted to bring up here is just maybe I'll just share this for a moment. Is that it's not only the kinds of material that Blake was talking about, where you see this orientalizing of Bosnia, but it's there are many cases of this. This is in Vienna in 1898. This is the Imperial Jubilee exhibition, which I've written about. And as you see here, the Bosnian pavilion, which was the most popular pavilion, complete orientalization, right? This effort to sort of fix Bosnian culture in an idealized way and then fold it into a conception of empire in this Habsburg way that's maybe not so different from what the French Empire was doing if you look at the French colonial expositions of the 1920s. Something else maybe for Blake to take a look at. I don't know if my sharing just died, but anyway, is of course which he doesn't mention in the paper, but he must know about, right? The Austro-Hungarian Monarchy in word and image, originally created under the auspices of the Crown Prince Rudolf, who kills himself. But it goes on, right? In the 1901 volume in this series, which each series is a different province, which both romanticizes the people there and talks about the geography and the flora and the fauna, but somehow makes this claim, as Blake is talking about, that it's natural for this to be protected and attached to Austria. And you see these ideal types of Bosnians and this vision of Sarajevo. So I would certainly say that that there's a lot more source material for Blake. Maybe he touches on that kind of source material elsewhere. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much more time. I would just say there's a lot more for them both to do, and maybe they've done it or do it in their dissertations, whether it's Shawn maybe more specifically talking about what it means that this colonial settler is a woman, for example, and for Blake, some of these other kinds of materials tying in what the Habsburg Empire was in specific relation to Bosnia. So let me turn to the question. You don't really have to respond to me, or though you can in your answers to some others, but let me go ahead and read a couple of questions. I'll give Blake a couple first. For Blake, this is from Neil Palmer. He writes, your work suggests that European colonies seem to have held a special place in the minds of imperialist powers, possibly because of the powerful effect of racist ideas shaping policies in places like Africa. Do you see evidence of racist ideas in Austro-Hungarian thinking about Bosnians? So did they consider themselves, but then I would ask who's themselves, right, as biologically, culturally superior? If not, how do they justify their modernizing mission there? And obviously it is different, right, from being in Southwest Africa. And this is similar, Blake. I'm just going to continue because these questions really overlap. Have you compared Austro-Hungarian treatment of the Bosnians to Russian treatment and thoughts toward Estonians, Letts, and others in their European colonies? So maybe you could respond to that, and then we'll move on to a couple of questions for Shawn.
Yeah, sure. And thank you very much. Those are two very wonderful and complicated questions. Let me actually begin my response in saying, yeah, my overall project, my dissertation, in fact, does look at a much larger kind of archive of material. And the works coming out, certainly the 1898 Imperial Exposition, the Millennial Exposition in Budapest, and the 1900 World's Fair, the Exposition Universale, kind of triangulate the overall aesthetic aspects of this mission very nicely. And I've been developing a list of resources from everything from the original artists that contributed the drawings and the writings in Rudolph's work to Sigmund Freud's own travels into Bosnia and how that relates to the development of psychoanalysis. So I've got a lot of different webs that I'm trying to tie into one coherent thing. As to the question of race, it's complicated in regards to Bosnia. In particular, during this time period, there was not really this coherent idea of who the Bosnian was. In fact, they didn't speak about Bosnians as if they were this sort of fully articulated subject. You certainly do see both in kind of the public discourse and in the private discourse racialized ideas against the South Slavs, and in particular, Serbians. Calais, one of his more well-known publications was The History of the Serbian People, where he was the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to Serbia in the 1860s, writes this book where he, in essence, says the Serbs are a lesser peoples. They need the culture. Only Austrian culture can, help bring them in. So there is definitely this sense of the cultural superiority in regards to the Serbs. The Catholic or predominantly Herzegovinian, or what we now think of as the Croatian segment of modern-day Bosnia-Herzegovina, is also a little different. Because of their links through Catholicism, in many ways, the Austrians speak of this Catholic peasantry much in a paternalistic way, but very much as if they are our brothers. They are our brethren, and we need to look out for them. They've just been kind of caught in this developmental gap because of the incursions of the Ottomans. The racialized language does take off when you hear them speak of the Turks. But what's interesting is after the Berlin Congress, the Turk is a subject that has left the space. They speak of, the old Ottoman outside of the Bosnian Muslim population. And this is where the kind of the biological and the cultural start to get very obscure, very not very clear lines of demarcation. So I think one of the reasons why I'm trying to draw out attention to the colonial mission is to really answer the question: how does this already multicultural empire that has internal divisions, kind of internal racialized logics of people within the empire, when you add in a Muslim population or you add in kind of a larger South Slav population, how does this affect the racial and cultural logic of empire? The second part of that question, how did they justify their modernizing mission there? I think the argument I'm making now is that that's kind of the key to attempting to link the land, the territory, to this pre-Ottoman invasion period. In essence, to say we are the rescuers of the European history here. We are bringing what was formerly this Illyrian or Roman province back into the fold of empire. And I think this is something that we don't really think of when we're speaking about certainly Southeastern Europe, but perhaps Europe more broadly, how as almost an antithesis to the scramble for Africa, there's this kind of double bind that's taking place. They're both other, but they're also formerly European. So they justified it as a rescue mission, in essence. I hope I answered that part, that question. The other one, in regards to Russia and their kind of European colonies, I have not started the comparison yet, though. I have a friend who is working on, specifically in the case of Estonia, kind of Russian, their colonial projects in the 19th century. And into the 20th century. So I'm hoping there'll be some productive work coming out of there. I have not yet made it, but I do very much see there being a lot of important connections that can be made between Austria-Hungary and Southeastern Europe and Russia, both in Eastern Europe, and it's explicitly going into the Caucasus and Central Asia. So thank you for that question too.
Thank you. I have a couple questions in the chat I'll give to Shawn. Two of them overlap with each other, so I'll put them together first, and then I'll read the second one. The first has to do with the racist ideas. So from Neil Palmer for Shawn, the racist ideas you describe in colonial wars in Africa did not only occur, of course, in Germany and German colonies. So what did the situation turn to genocide there? Why did the situation, I guess, turn to genocide there, but not in French, Belgian, or British colonies? Does your work suggest these ideas were more influential in Germany than elsewhere? And close to that, from Stephen Stilwell, if you look for comparisons in German East Africa and the Maji rebellion against German imperial economic policies. So there we're asking about both why it seemed to be worse, is the suggestion of the first one, in the German colony in Southwest Africa, and the other says, is there, how would you compare that to the Maji rebellion against German overlordship elsewhere? And then the next one, just because you can answer that together maybe, and the second question for you is going to be about this from Travis Eakin. Some of the older historiography on the Kaiserreich focuses on the power of Hegelian rhetoric in creating the notion that Germans had a special duty to bring civilization to the world. And Isabel's Hull's Absolute Destruction views the German army's actions in Southwest Africa as part of a continuum extending from Franco-Prussian War to the rape of Belgium. Do you agree at all with this Zonderweg interpretation, or do you see what you're describing as essentially European phenomena? Well, it's also related, the other two questions, the one comparing, right? Why, or what are the differences with the French, if there are, Belgian, British colonies, and so on. So let me leave it to you, Shawn.
Thank you, Dr. Unowsky, and thank you all for the questions. They're all broaching a pretty similar topic that you can't get away from when you're doing the history of Germany and the German Empire. Everybody's looking for continuities. Was it mentioned in one of these questions, the Zonderweg thesis? Was there a a special, unique path for German modernity. And that really is the million-dollar question that has been plaguing us since the 70s and the 80s, going all the way back to the Historiker Strike. And I wish I had the definitive answer, but unfortunately I don't. If I figure it out and I publish that book, I'm sure I'll win a million prizes. But just to speak to some of these questions specifically, is that first, Dr. Palmer, why did the situation turn to genocide in the German case, but not in the French, Belgian, or the British cases? Well, it depends on how you define genocide, really, right? It's only because we do have this from General Lothar von Traffa. We do have the Vernichtungsbefehl, the annihilation order that Isabel Hull cites in her book, Absolute Destruction. And we have that piece of evidence, but we have some evidence. We don't have, like, particularly the same thing. We don't have the annihilation order from the French in Algeria or West Africa, or the Belgians in the Congo, or the British in Kenya, or even from the Germans during the Maji uprising. We don't have this one specific thing. But does that mean that those also weren't in some way genocide or mass murder or something awful? And I think that's the million-dollar question that no one has a great answer for. There's also the line of argument, the line of thinking, the line of argumentation that I happen to agree with, is that in a way Germany was unique, but there's this great quote from a quasi-related topic where Christopher Clark wrote a great book called The Sleepwalkers, but it was specifically about World War I. And he said, if there's enough evidence to prove that Germany was responsible for World War I, there's also enough evidence to prove that Russia, Britain, France, even Serbia is equally as responsible for the outbreak of the First World War. I would transfer that argument to, if there's enough evidence to demonstrate that Germany performed a genocide in Southwest Africa, which I 100% agree that they did, there's also enough evidence that the British did the same thing, that the French did the same thing, that the Germans did the same thing in German East Africa during the Maji uprising. You could even transfer this outside of Africa into the 1857 uprising in British India, right before the Raj, with the Sepoy uprising. There are so many continuities throughout European empire that to say that one is unique, one is Sonder, one is a Sonderweg towards modernity, I think would be unfair and would be to categorize German in their own special way. But the reason that it's so easy to say that Germany is unique in this way is because, of course, there was a World War Part II and a modern industrialized genocide that we've never seen in any other way. So by retroactively looking for precursors to genocide, it's easy to find some because there's such a plethora of evidence in Southwest Africa, also in German East Africa. But to do that would, in my opinion, historiography, as we've proven this already, and as one of the questions alludes to, is it's already the older historiography on the Kaiserreich. We've proven all this already, and it's fascinating and it's interesting. And the reason that I started this presentation or began this paper 2.5 years ago is because that was my point of entry. Was when you type in German historiography, you get the Sonderweg, the continuity thesis from Windhoek to von Windhoek nach Auschwitz, is a Jürgen Zimmerer book from 2001, I believe, is looking for the continuities from Windhoek in Southwest Africa to the Holocaust and the Second World War. That was my point of entry. And as I've gotten into this more and more, I don't want to say it's become obvious, but it's more or less become obvious that the racist ideas that existed in Germany, they existed everywhere, unquestionably. And it's fascinating, it's interesting, and it's about time we recognize this. Only within, 2014 or 2015, the German government officially recognized the Herrera genocide as a genocide, and maybe now there's a plan for reparations. So it's all significant, and it's all over 100 years later finally coming to a head, and it's about time. I hope that satisfies the questions. Maybe I was just rambling for my own sake, but I hope that satisfies the questions. And again, thank you so much for the questions. As Dr. Unowsky alluded to at the beginning, I'm still in the midst of my dissertation, and I need all the questions and all the help I can get.
Thank you. Let me ask another one from the chat, and then if no one adds some other things, because this would exhaust those questions, then I'll have a couple of questions for the two of you that I alluded to at the beginning. So this is for Blake. In relation, from Peter Thompson, in relation to your claim, the Austrians engaged in a distinctly aesthetic modernization project compared to projects of material science and technology developed by the French and British. If architecture is a major site of this project, why should it be viewed distinctly as an aesthetic vision rather than one of material urban development? And here I'll add in that what you're talking about with Calais and the construction of the urban environment, right, in Bosnia, he was doing what was happening in all the urban centers of the monarchy, and architects in all those centers studied in Vienna and Budapest, and architects from Vienna and Budapest and Lemberg even traveled around and were hired in urban centers everywhere from there to Trieste. So I don't know if you can speak a little bit more to what you're saying there, as opposed to saying this is urban development, to say this is an aesthetic vision, I guess, is if you could clarify that some more.
Yeah, that's a great question. One that my dissertation committee threw at me in my prospectus, by the way, so of the same mindset. Why should it be viewed distinctly as an aesthetic vision rather than one of material urban development? I think this, somewhat unfortunately, this might not be the good answer, but this alludes to my background in theory. And what I'm looking at here is, I think the significance of the aesthetic vision is drawing attention to how, if we can call it such a thing, this Austro-Hungarian imperialism is functioning, and why it is choosing, while the scientific and the technological is still there, it is as if they are attempting to say, well, we're seeing the problems that are occurring at this time in other colonial situations. We're going to use an entirely different approach, one that is first and foremost aesthetic. And the reason for that is, I think, when you look at the influence of, in particular, German aesthetic thought in the development of different ideologies and different forms of governance in Austria-Hungary, you see that it is more about the belief, as Calais himself said, is that colonialism, or at least in this case, this imperial project, whatever we want to call it, can only really work if the technologies are aimed at harnessing the spirit of the Bosnian subject, as in it has to have an affective quality to it. The colonial subject has to be drawn to the empire, drawn into its sort of patriotic love for the emperor in ways that might not necessarily play out in just kind of a purely rational or positivist form of imperialism. And this is why Calais himself is drawing on, obviously, what's being done, as Dr. Unowsky says, is the urban renewal projects that are taking place in the empire, throughout the empire, in the major urban centers. But he is specifically handpicking his architects, pulling them out of the Vienna School, in particular, those students of Otto Wagner, for a reason. And, we know in his, for example, his translation of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, we know that one of the things that Calais emphasizes in the introduction is, the only way that you can guarantee this, ideal individual subject in an absolutist world is by controlling culture. Culture is not just the source of power, but it is also the place in which the individual can achieve its full autonomy. Make no mistake, Calais is not kind of a progressive liberal. He is 100% an absolutist. He believes, though, that individuals should have the freedom of creativity. And this is a distinctly aesthetic idea that we find in kind of that German, Austro-German line of the cult of Hellenic Greece coming out of Winckelmann and on through Schiller and on up. So I think my attention to the aesthetic vision is meant to not say that there's kind of this binary between the material and the aesthetic, but more to say that this is an entirely new theorization of empire, that they have confronted this double subject in Bosnia, and they have to rethink not just the science and technology, but the different types of aesthetic principles that they are going to attach to the colonial mission. Sorry, was the other one the rhetoric surrounding the major distinctions in rhetoric? I'll go ahead and jump on that. I am currently looking at making those comparisons. That's kind of a later phase in my project, but I will say this. What we do find, one, in Austria, there is ample public discourse about how the colonial project in Bosnia is both different and better than what is taking place in the British and French colonies. And two, certainly following the 1900 exposition, we have evidence of both British and French visitors saying the Austro-Hungarians have figured it out. They have figured out the ideal model of colonialism. We need to bring this back to France and Great Britain, and there's actually United States papers are publishing similar comments of saying we need to copy what Austria-Hungary has done in Bosnia. This will solve the problems of difference we're having in our colonies. So this is something that I'm further exploring, obviously, but I have not quite figured out exactly the distinctions between the rhetoric in all of those cases, but I have some trails that I'm starting to follow.
And I think this idea of invisibility is promising because, of course, the Habsburg provinces were not colonies. I mean, I would say, but like Galicia, as I explained, at least on the political level, and so there's to extend at least some of that idea even in their colony, that we're not really a colony, we're not really controlling you, and its invisibility makes sense for the Habsburg case. A couple of other things have popped up, so I'll just read them to you. Peter Thompson has a few comments and says maybe Dirk Moses's recent work is of interest in relation to the question about genocide. Maybe the term itself is historically specific, and perhaps we need to jettison the term entirely. I don't know if Shawn will want to speak to that, or we can just leave that. And then Professor Palmer asks, why would Austro-Hungarians want to create Bosnian national identity? Wouldn't this encourage nationalist independent movements? Did the goals of art overpower awareness of this political reality? I mean, I think what maybe I shouldn't, it's hard for me as a Habsburg historian not to say something, but the idea of a Bosnian territorial based in a way identity with the, some connection to the past would be a way of giving an umbrella, so you don't have the divisions of Serb and Croat and Bosniak and so on. But maybe Blake can speak to that. And Peter Thompson also says to Blake, very interesting, seems to return our focus to Shorsky's style of intellectual cultural history. Certainly we always hear Shorsky's work in the background whenever we talk about Habsburg issues at the turn of the century. So I don't know if either of you have any comments to those, or if we want to move to sort of some final questions I may have, but feel free to say, make any other comments to that if you want. Shawn?
Yeah, just real quick, Dr. Thompson, thank you. Yes, A. Dirk Moses just published a book. I think it just came out. It's called The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security in the Language of Transgression. And Dr. Thompson's comment has kind of hit the nail on the head. The term genocide is so loaded that, like, if you keep saying a thing over and over and over and over again, does it eventually lose meaning? Right. Maybe it's time to move on. So just real briefly, thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Thompson. Yes, 100%. If you haven't read The Problems of Genocide, just published, I don't work for Dr. Moses, but it's definitely a book worth looking into.
Yeah, I'll jump in here real quick and say to Dr. Thompson, yes, Shorsky, I'm maybe tilting at Windmills Hill here, but I think there's an importance in kind of going back after the years of wonderful work, kind of building on Shorsky's model of critiquing it and breaking it apart. And perhaps it is because the thing that's striking about Shorsky is, it's about the politics of the present that, his model is really important to addressing. And I think we're kind of back at a point not dissimilar from the 1960s, 1970s when he's developing the Fin-de-siècle model. And I think it's there is, to some extent, to go back to the original work. Although I will say that, being a theorist that I am sort of applying more of a Gramscian crisis theory to it. But certainly Shorsky grounds my own work. And then to this wonderful, absolutely brilliant question about why did they want to create this Bosnian national identity? Yes, it was aimed at creating an apolitical anti-national identity. And I think the great irony that I'm seeing is that in the effort of doing this and introducing these kind of new modern cultural institutions and helping to project what we can somewhat problematically call the indigenous art practices in Bosnia. The mission creates an avant-garde movement that we are very familiar with today, and that's where Princip comes out of, this kind of avant-garde, young, kind of the school movements of people that are reading modernist literature, and kind of they've gotten into Nietzsche and some of the later theorists, and all of a sudden they're thinking to themselves, well, wait a second, what is Austria-Hungary trying to do? We're going to express our own forms of identities, and ultimately this in many ways creates the tools for the empire's own demise. But I don't think, it's not that the goals of art overpower the awareness of the political reality. What I'm trying to do with my project is to show that the goals of art were what the Habsburgs saw as the solution to the political realities. And it very well may be that that was incorrect, or it was problematic, or it was contradictory. But this is, in trying to attach kind of the great theoretical work, I think Terry Eagleton comes to mind with his ideology of the aesthetic, to the way aesthetics is actually played out in practice. I mean, I think we see that, this was just art and culture was the solution to politics for Austria-Hungary in the case of their colonial mission. And ultimately, I'm not making the claim that that's why we got to Sarajevo in 1914, but I think there's a lot that can be said of, the relationship between those two. So I'll finish there.
thanks to all the questions asked. Thank you very much. And to both of you, maybe I'll just ask, maybe one of you could say something to this. Two really intriguing, interesting papers, very promising projects coming out of Georgia State. And maybe you could say something about the program there and how this came about, this focus on Central Europe and Empire. For your papers and for the third paper we didn't get a chance to hear. Could either of you speak very briefly? We only have a few minutes left to say something about that academic scene there.
It's the best in the country.
Yeah, so this...
Shawn, do you want to take this? You're good at this.
Oh, am I? Blake and I, we actually have the exact same advisor, Dr. Jared Poley, who we both came to Georgia State to the history department here because of Jared Poley. And not only him, but there's also a few other Central Europeanists that are working here. Joe Perry and Greg Moore are all three of them are basically, we don't have committee members. We have three advisors, and it's great. It's wonderful. And in the spring of 2018, I believe, Jared Poley offered a class on a seminar on Fin-de-siècle Europe, and we all took it. And the original idea, or the original reason we put this all together was because this came out of our seminar papers for that class. And it's just, we happen to be working on similar topics, and it was like, oh, we maybe we have a theme here. Maybe we have a Central European Empire theme that we can work into a manageable conference presentation, and everything worked out really well. Our third presenter also was in that, the man that was supposed to be here. He was also in that class with us, and we all just happened to be Empire guys, and we all just happened to have the same advisor. And like Blake said, Georgia State is the best. It really is.
Well, you made a good case for that, and my congratulations to both of you and to Jared Poley and the other professors at Georgia State for the reflected program in the two presentations that we just saw. Very good luck to both of you, and wish you well. We're just about at the end. So for everybody, thank you. I really maybe we'll give a round of applause to our presenters, and thanks also to the questions. So good luck to all of you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all.